I met somebody who'd started teaching themselves Greek or learning Greek using Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, but he found it really hard and he gave up. In this video, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the 3 reasons that I think make learning Greek particularly, very difficult for the average person. And we'll talk a little bit about what we can do about some of those things as well. So let's get into it. First up, one of the things that makes learning Greek really difficult is grammar. Now, I know that there are approaches to learning Greek where you don't have to learn grammar, but I don't think that's the right way to learn. I've recorded videos on that already, and you can find those on the, if you do a search around on this channel. But the point here is that grammar actually makes learning Greek quite challenging. And the reason for this is not necessarily because grammar itself is unnecessary, or because grammar itself is unhelpful, or because grammar itself is hard even. It's actually more because of the way we are taught grammar in school. I remember when I was in school, learning grammar was one of those things that seemed like an afterthought for schools. It's kind of like it was being phased out at that stage, back in my day, I guess you could say. And it wasn't really well taught. We kind of learnt what a noun was, we kind of learnt what a verb was, and the rest of it kind of seemed very fuzzy. And I think there's a number of reasons for this. One, I think we don't really have a lot to compare it to. If all you're doing is learning a single language, learning grammar is actually, I feel, more challenging. I felt that when I started to learn Greek, I actually learned more about grammar learning Greek than I did about learning grammar when I was, learning English and in school. And part of the reason for that, I think, is that when you're learning your own language and all you know is your own language, you're trying to work out, well, what's the difference between a verb and a noun? And I think English itself actually makes this more challenging because we have gerunds and things like this that actually confuse us with participles and all these kinds of things. So there's a number of areas that make it quite challenging, of course, when it comes to learning Greek and learning grammar at the same time. Now, there are some helps for this, of course. Sam Lamberson has a little book, this one here, which you might want to look at, which is about how to ace grammar, or English grammar at least, when you come to learn Greek. Personally, though, I really like the idea of learning grammar as you learn Greek, and so that's what we kind of do inside our membership. Now, because we find Greek so hard to learn when we're in school, this often means that we actually learn to not like it, because typically when we don't understand something well, we don't want to learn that again because, well, it's just vague and who knows what it actually means. And I think this is one of the things that puts a lot of people off learning Greek, and particularly using the Grammar Translate method, is that they don't know grammar well enough. They hate grammar because of the poor way they've been taught it, and they don't give it a chance. And I think this makes learning Greek much more difficult than it needs to be. So that's the first thing. Learning grammar is hard, and particularly given our background and all of that kind of thing. But it actually can be kind of fun and enjoyable, and it's certainly very helpful as you start to learn how the language is working and how authors are constructing sentences and how the different elements fit together. Grammar is really helpful in those times, and certainly you can't use academic commentaries or technical commentaries without knowing the grammar, and knowing it to a pretty decent degree as well. So grammar is one of those things that makes learning Greek really hard. The second thing I think that makes learning Greek really difficult is the amount of information that most grammars will pack into each lesson. This is a big one, and I think the reason for this is that really when somebody writes a grammar, for the most part, they're doing it from the context of a semester, a Greek semester, normally 1 or 2 semesters, and you've got to go through a certain amount at a certain pace to be able to get through the whole thing. And I think some of this also goes back to the way grammars have historically been written as well, and the audience for which they've been written. So historically, going back to the last point, grammar not being taught well in schools, it used to be that when you were in school, you would learn Latin and perhaps some Greek as well, and English back in the day. And so learning grammar would actually be much easier in that case. And so that means then that when you came to learn Greek, when you looked at the Greek grammar, you'd already have some of these concepts nailed down. But when you don't have that grammatical background and you don't know different languages before you start, you have to learn a huge amount to be able to even understand what some things are. Things like a declension. What on earth is a declension? And so what you end up finding is, in addition to noun and verb endings, you also come to terms with these new ideas like declensions and participles and clauses and phrases and all these kinds of things that you've kind of not really got a good definition on often before you start. Now, the other thing that comes with this in terms of the sheer quantity information is the way some grammars are structured. For instance, Mounce. Let's talk about Mounce as an example, then we'll talk about beginning with New Testament Greek. But Mounce has, in chapter 6, if you're coming to Greek for the first time, this is really where it starts to hit. So in chapter 6, this is really going to start to learn nouns and how they work, right? And in this one chapter, you're going to learn the nominative and accusative cases. You're going to learn masculine, feminine, and neuter endings. You're going to learn singular and plural as well. All of that's in one lesson. Then in the next lesson, you're going to do some of those things like the masculine, feminine, and neuter, and the singular and plural all over again, but for this time for the genitive and the dative. And so that means that you've got a lot of information to take in just that one chapter, chapter 6, and then chapter 7, even though it's a little less, these are whole new things that you've never come across before, genitive and dative, and we don't have quite the same thing in English, so datives are a bit different and all this kind of thing. So that makes it hard. And the same goes for things like beginning with New Testament Greek, which is, I think, an easier grammar to grasp. But I feel that this is just a huge amount for the new person to try and learn all at once. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm writing out my own grammar and my own approach to Greek is to break these things into as smaller chunks as possible. So we'll do, like nominative and accusative, for instance, in one lesson, but we'll only do it with second declension masculine words and only in the singular. So you don't learn singular and plural until later. You don't learn the feminine and neuter endings until later. And we come at those things in their own. So I think breaking this into smaller chunks and introducing the concepts more slowly to students is a really helpful way to do that. And this is one of the things I think that the sheer amount of information per lesson or per chapter can just make it overwhelming for the average person. But the third thing I think that makes learning Greek really, really difficult is the fact that you have to retain so many of these ideas, and particularly things like noun endings and verb endings and the article and all these kinds of things. You have to retain those actively in your mind, which means then that you've got a whole different skill set that's required around how to actually learn the material than what you would need if you were going to go through, say, a history class or a chemistry class perhaps, or perhaps some other kind of class where you don't necessarily have the same sheer amount of data to remember in order to be able to go from one lesson to another. And there's often also, with most of these grammars, not much guidance about how to actually learn these things. So for instance, with Mounce, he's going to give you all the information, he's going to give you a workbook, go through the exercise in the workbook, but there's this big gap between the material in the chapter on the one hand and the workbook on the other. And how do you get from here to here so that you can actually do the material in the workbook? And that's where I think a lot of these grammars are really they're challenging for the average person. I think beginning with New Testament Greek by Drs. Merkel and Plummer is a good exception here. They do give you some guidance around this. They say with each of the paradigms, just write this paradigm out 10 times. And that's good, that's something. And this is where I came up with the 4-part framework that we now use in our own beginning Greek process and all of the beginning Greek that we teach inside of our mastery membership. So what we do in this is we assume you're going to go and read the text and watch the video and that kind of thing. Then what we're going to do is we're going to give you some paradigms to learn, and we're going to encourage you to write those out. And we try and consolidate the paradigms down to just as few as possible, so it just reduces the amount of work you have to actually do. If you master those paradigms, then you've pretty much got beginning Greek sorted. The second thing you do after mastering that is, of course, you're going to work on your vocabulary, and it's just learn the vocabulary for this week's work or this whatever it is, sections work, and then review all the vocabulary you already know. That's the second thing. The third thing then is to go through and do some parsing practice, and this is where something like Parse Greek or one of the other parsing apps can be really helpful. And I've done a review of all the different parsing apps. It was a couple of years ago now, but you can find a link to that video with a review to those parsing apps up here as well. So check that out if you're interested in what parsing apps, at least a couple of years ago, were really good. And the market's changed a little bit, not hugely, so it's still a relevant video. But we recommend you use a parsing app and check that out and just spend 5 minutes a day. It's going to make a huge difference. And then finally, the fourth thing to do is to do a little bit of translation work every day. Just about every grammar comes with its own translation exercises for you to do. Some of them are built into the book, like with Begin with New Testament Greek. Other ones you have to buy a separate book for, like with Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek. Some of them don't really give you much, but whatever it is, I would encourage you to do a little bit of translation every day. as part of your work. So every day you're going to be doing those 4 things. You're going to be reviewing your vocabulary, you're going to be reviewing those paradigms to make sure you keep them in your mind, you're going to be practicing your passing, and you're going to be translating some of the texts that you've been given to translate for that lesson. And if you do that, that's going to help you to retain what you learn on a lesson by lesson basis. But that's really important to do that, and if you don't do that, it's going to make it really, really hard to be able to master the concepts. And I think this is one of the things that many people underestimate, just the amount of work that needs to be done to keep that material top of mind, even as you start to learn new concepts. So if you want more information about that 4-part framework, then download the Roadmap to Mastery at bma.to/roadmap. We've just updated it, so you can get a copy of that by following that link down below there. If you've got anything that you think makes beginning Greek hard, I'd love to hear from you. Put it in the comment section below, and I'd love to be able to address that and think through that as well as we start to work on how do we do a better job of our beginning Greek for you as well. So let us know in the comment section below what I've missed that makes beginning Greek so hard. I look forward to seeing you there. Otherwise, watch out for the next video. Thanks so much for watching. I look forward to serving you then. Until then, keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. I'll see you then.